to another episode of Unconditioned Mind. Unconditioned Mind is a project of Awakened, and that is a movement that seeks to contribute towards gender and racial inequality. I have an exciting guest for us today, Professor Pumla Gobodo-Madikizela. We're going to talk about racial inequality. So maybe, Prof, you can start by, introducing yourself, tell us where you are, what are you doing at the moment?
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's such a pleasure to be in conversation with you about this really urgent topic of our time. I am based at Stellenbosch University. I'm a professor there. I was trained as a clinical psychologist, and I've been working more recently at Stellenbosch University, running a center called the Center for the Study of the Afterlife of Violence and the Reparative Quest. I'm also, and probably this is the more important identity, professional identity, I'm also the South African Research Chair for Transgenerational Trauma and Transformation. And this is these SACHI chairs, they're called SACHI chairs, South African, for short, SACHI chair. It's South African research chairs. They are academic research positions that are awarded to senior researchers to pursue a research program in a particular area of interest that is needed in society. So my interest and my professional interest and my research for a number of years has been on historical trauma and how to deal with it, how to repair or how to restore. There are many languages now that are used which capture the notion of healing. So broadly speaking, that's my background, and mainly really being at Stellenbosch. And the center itself, the research center, is a center for training of graduate students, honors, masters, PhD students, and mentoring emerging researchers, specifically postdoctoral fellows. We have affiliations with international scholars who often come as visitors to the center to engage in public dialogue programs on these issues, very similar to what we are doing here, but with an inclination towards exploration and research and investigation and publishing on these areas. And so this is what the student researchers do and the postdoctoral fellows do.
Wow. Maybe we'll have time for you to talk about this trauma thing, because I think it's a big topic. But maybe let's just start to focus on this racism thing. Just as an expert, if you can just unpack racism, because when I look at this topic, it's very complex. I don't think we understand it. And how does it then translate to racial inequality? Just from your perspective as an expert.
You're right to say it's so complex because it's so broad. There are many, definitions of what racism is. And I think what's important to understand is that these attitudes that are within the social sphere, they become definitions of our understanding of others. And racism falls into that category of a particular construct that is used to others. It's an othering construct that's based on the skin color of the person. But as you say, it is broad, it is complex, and sometimes it's not racism based on color, but it's racism based on ethnicity. And sometimes color, there's a gray line, really that divides what is color. So you find that, for example, people who are in our country identified as colored might be racist towards others, who are blacker or who are African. So and in places like Brazil, for example, racism gets even more complicated because it's not a question of pure white against pure black. It's all these kind of aspects of blackness or or dimensions of blackness. So racism is as we understand it, it's a tool that was designed to oppress. It's not just about othering. It's also relates to oppression, which links to the idea of inequality. Because if it's used to oppress, then it means that the policies, the laws, the opportunities that governments create for its people are divided in terms of who is superior and who is inferior, or who is perceived as inferior and who is perceived as superior. And apartheid in South Africa, apartheid becomes an important reference point for understanding the issue of inequality, because here and in places like the US with the history of slavery, there have been these laws that have been designed to exclude, to undermine the potential of people of color, Black people, Africans, coloreds, Indians in our country, for example. And so that's inequality. Inequality is how laws are systematically established to exclude others over time, and that becomes systematic racism. And so that is the distinction. But it's also, there's an overlap of these concepts, because then the practice of racism itself is informed by these racial inequalities, these laws that exclude others.
But maybe take us back, because racism was not always there. There were always, wars amongst nations, slavery. You could be taken into slavery, whatever the color of your skin. But there is a point where this concept of racism was born into our society, into the world, let's put it that way. It seems very normal. It's like we've always lived with racism. But I'm not a deep researcher or anything like that, but I just realized that, no, it started at some point in time when then it became, a tool to oppress others for gain, really, to be honest.
Yeah, I wonder about that. I know that there is scholarship that suggests like a clear starting point. And it may well be so in terms of defining racism in terms of skin color. But the practice of othering others has always been there. You could think, for example, centuries ago, the 15th century being probably it's kind of like a landmark period, because that's where the birth of the practice of slavery became, really quite active. However, if we think even before that, there were religious kinds of, with the the Christian wars against the Muslims, for example, and the Jews. And I think the term may not necessarily have been coined then, but the act of othering others as belonging, as not like us, as the idea that we are better than them, whether religiously better or economically better, but especially religiously better. The Crusades, that period of the Crusades, for example, was in a way a form, I think, of what now we might think of as racism, because it was othering the Muslims. They were the Antichrist, and people were murdered and killed because they were other. So this notion of othering others has always been there with us. And then, of course, with the whole use of slavery for purposes of enriching powers that be, the use of people were perceived as inferior. The fact that Africans were taken and stolen and forced and abducted from their villages, that in itself was an act of power over others. And so that act then sealed this idea that you are, by virtue of how you come to be in this place, you are inferior. The fact that you were seen as inferior and you're seen as labor. You are seen, so throughout, the centuries, Africans, for example, were seen not just by whites, but by Arabs, were seen as inferior, and so treated as such. And so the growth and the development of a capitalistic consciousness required that there were people who were designated as the labor force that could be sold for money.
Yes.
And so you are inferior, you can be sold, in fact, you are property, you are owned as property. And that has continued, in fact, even right up until the 18th and the 19th century, when then racial science then also was part of the discourse on racism, with people being shipped all over the shore, but mainly shipped mostly from the continent of Africa into Europe, into the US. I mean, there are stories where people were shipped to these countries mainly to study their physical body. So racism was not just a skin thing, it was more the physical body, how the mind, there are scholars of intellectual functioning who studied intellectual, and not long ago, 19th and 20th century, who studied it and published major books on how Black people are intellectually inferior, measuring their brains, And so there have been these debates on intellectual and these are scholars from places like Stanford University, well-known stories, texts that are well established. And along with that, there have been other texts that debunk those kinds of studies. There are things like even including the study of penis sizes of Black people, as a sign of their intellectual, as a marker of intellectual functioning, between, the study of penis sizes and the study of brain sizes, all of that mixed together, in what is called scholarship. So there are all these kinds of ways of normalizing racism throughout the ages, both from the perspective of the economic sciences to how Black bodies are perceived as juxtaposed with white bodies. So the shape of the body, how your shape, you will recall that not very long ago, there was a debate in South Africa about how Saki Bartman was shipped to France to study her body as the body of a so-called Hottentot. And so that was all in line with their thinking about racial science. There are groups of Black people. I was at Harvard about 2 years ago when Harvard was investigating its relationship with slavery. And they were studying themselves, their own relationship and contribution to slavery, to the history of slavery, like an interrogation of themselves, of Harvard as an institution, and a really great project. And it's not Harvard alone, there are other universities there, but I was at this conference where they were launching their report on Harvard's relationship with slavery. It's available online. And within that report, when I was preparing for my presentation at that launch, I found that there were 4 Black people who were shipped in the 19th century when anthropology was beginning to study racism. Racial science was becoming a science. And they shipped Black people, and the way they term them in this book, it's a Fingo, it's a Hottentot, it's a Zulu, I forget what the 4th one is. They shipped these young people to Harvard to be paraded in Boston for study of their physical features, to understand the differences, the racial differences between Black and white. Can you imagine that? One of these people, his name is a Stearman from the clearly from the Western Cape. And that Stearman is very common in the studies of slavery in the Western Cape. Stearman was one of the 4 people shipped by this group of scholars, of anthropologists and other scholars to Harvard to be studied. And this young man, Stearman, was 17 years old. After a week of this parading of himself, he couldn't bear it. He committed suicide.
Wow.
And that is, it is in the report, that is available. And his remains are in the museum at Harvard. So there are all these stories that have as yet to be, unearthed about the racist methods in the so-called research of professionals at universities.
I mean, how are we ever going to heal from this past with stories like that? But I mean, you talk about otherness. I'm really interested in your understanding of this blackness and whiteness issue, because you talk to people. I mean, I was talking to a young lady about racism, for instance, from Kenya, and he said, this blackness and whiteness thing is a South African thing, because in Kenya I don't see myself as black. And there's no issue of blackness and whiteness. And I was reading a lady also from the continent who said when she got to America, that's when this whole thing of blackness and whiteness became a big issue, where she had to, you had to group yourself, you're either white or black. And she had to, come to terms with that and realize that, okay, therefore, I'm therefore black. And so, I mean, I was also talking to someone who's working here from Argentina, who also was saying, when I got here, I was asked, what are you? Are you black or white? And I mean, I couldn't understand this question. I eventually had to say, okay, have this and have this and have that. And just talk to us about this issue of blackness and whiteness.
It is complex. And there are, in fact, the complexity speaks to just how senseless this idea of race is, In fact, sometimes exactly this question, is a person black or white? Because sometimes you find people, although they are mixed, in the way of being mixed parents, parental heritage, but in terms of these racial categories, you don't know where to place them because you're supposed to place them. And in fact, South Africa designed a method of placing them. And they created the label colored. Even this notion of colored is a racial category that is a South African category to find a way of putting you in a box. And the reason for putting people in a box is in order to discriminate them. Do you discriminate less these ones because they are less black and more white? And to discriminate more these others who are actually blacker. So it's a category that is perverse. It's a perverse way of dealing with people's identity. And I think that because we are brought up in a society that is racialized, in apartheid society, I'm talking now within our own context, and I dare say actually in many contexts, even in those contexts where people the dominant groups are black, there are always white people in these countries. I mean, in Zambia, in Kenya, in these countries that are, they're supposed to be actually only black people only live there. That's not true. There are always white people. There is a socialization, a consciousness that, through mass media, through watching television and mass media of any kind, even people who come from countries that don't have apartheid, for example, it may not necessarily be defined very succinctly in the way that it is in our country as apartheid, but there's an awareness, even for those people who come from these countries. They come to a country like South Africa, they may not live through apartheid, but their bodies know that I'm black. When they go to America for the first time, they don't have to be told. They know they may not have to define it in their country because they live as black people. But even there are always these divisions of you are richer, you are from a poorer area. So there's always this awareness of how people are measured against others. And blackness and whiteness becomes a category in South Africa that is so racialized because we brought up in that, in that atmosphere. So you become aware. You can't really define it in terms of saying what is blackness outside of the social consciousness. But the social consciousness becomes internalized. So my blackness as a black person is defined by my social and historical context. It's not necessarily the definition of who you are physically speaking, but it's who you are socially speaking.
Exactly.
How are you positioned with this society? What has been your historical experience, of who you are? It's very much, mediated by all these reference points of social, cultural, historical definitions of who we are. The challenge, so for black and for white, the challenge is, how are you located within your blackness? Mm-hmm. Are you located within your blackness from the perspective of the definition of the other? In other words, of how the other defines your blackness? Or have you found a way of defining your blackness so that it is an empowered blackness rather than an inferiorized blackness that is defined by whiteness? That becomes the important aspect of this understanding what blackness means and what whiteness means. Now, from the white person's perspective, are they defining their whiteness in terms of who they are in relation to blackness? So again, there, it's a socialization. The socialization of you are white, therefore you are superior. You are better, you've got better opportunities. And there are white people who have never engaged with black people as equals. There really are those white people who come. I am at a university, we see them all the time. Young people who for the first time are going to be at a resident with black people. They don't know how to relate to them as equals because the black people they know are their nannies, their gardeners, their farm workers who are seen as this mass of people who are lumped in the back of the truck to work in the field or to be picked up on the side of the road to work in the garden. That's their definition of what blackness is. And so they enter already the social world with the perception that I am superior. The tragedy for them is that so often when they actually encounter blackness in the real world and they discover that it's not the definition that they're
used to, yes.
They're used to, it disrupts their whole worldview. And they are challenged in very difficult ways. And some of them, because this is so difficult and overwhelming, they project the violence of just this tension of who am I then? If this black person, it seems this black person is superior to me, or is more intelligent, they get A's and I get C's, or they carry themselves with this confidence that I'm not used to. Who am I then? So this issue of the socialization and the internalization of these normalized definitions of what it is to be black and what it is to be white are really the definers. And it depends, how is that socialization? Is it an empowered socialization? Or for white people, is it a realistic socialization that suggests that actually there is equality and therefore I am who I am depending on the character of who I am or on what I can do, what I'm capable of doing, rather than simply as a white person. And when all those constructs are dismantled, when the edifices of racism, which suggests your superiority is a given, then it throws them asunder. It throws their identity into chaos. And it's a struggle to try and, hold on to some semblance of what they understand. I give you just one last very quick example. When my son was about 7 or perhaps even younger, he he took karate lessons, was training karate. We were in Cape Town. He was the only black boy in a class, in that karate class of white boys. They're all running around, they're excited, and they love each other, they connect. I mean, they're 6 years, and remember that these 6, 7 years old are probably looked after by a black woman who loves them. And so they have a relationship that is a motherly, normal relationship with loving someone who loves you, like that closeness that is innocent. And so in their consciousness, there isn't a consciousness about color as such. Then there isn't even a seeing of color at that age, because that kind of consciousness, that what has been internalized, is the human empathy and connection. So we come with parents, white parents, and I'm the only black parents, to pick up our kids. It was a grading exam for karate. They all rush out from their rooms, from their grading rooms. They rush out in their karate kids' outfits, wanting to connect with their mothers. And this boy, who was friends with my son, he asked, "Who's your mom? Which one is your mother?" And my son points at me and said, "The one in a blue tracksuit." I mean, I'm the only black mother there, but he doesn't say the black one. And this boy, had he had that outlook of seeing color at that age, he would have known that I must be the mother. But he has to ask, "Who is your mother?"
Exactly.
And there were not many, the grading, as we were about 8 or so mothers. And my son says the one in a blue tracksuit. Now, a few years later, we are in the US, and now our children are protected. We protect our children, we expose them to, we have our own world, is a world of diversity. We grow up in that, especially our generation, the generation of black consciousness. There's an awareness that you live in a diverse world, and you have made friends over the years with a diverse group of people, black, colored, Indian. So these are the people who come to your home, and your child sees all this diversity and relates to the diversity. And so when they go to school, to this Model C school at this early stage, they're mixing, they're coming to our homes, they're doing sleepovers and so on. My son we go to the US, and now he's 10 years old now. And it was incredible. He went to this school, it's a public school in the US. And in no time, I could see an awareness of his blackness.
Wow.
Now, the point is not that he was not, one has to be nuanced about this, of course. He knows who he is, but the awareness of blackness is this idea of a consciousness of blackness and what it means in society. Now my son, and he didn't speak about it necessarily, but the kinds of things that he was doing now, he wanted to braid his hair. He wanted to braid his hair. He wanted, the kids were calling, his name is Bahle, so they were, Bashle, Bakwe. They were calling him all sorts of things. And he says, "Mom, I'm now going to call myself Madik, from his surname Madikizela." He says, "I'm tired of people,
mispronouncing my name.
Yeah, calling me in all sorts of things that are not me." That's how he put it. They're calling me in all sorts of things that are not me. And he became violent. They would call him all these names, and there was, of course, racism in the field. And the first time I was called to the school, he had taken a white boy and picked him up. He's 10 years old, and he's biggish for his age, took this boy up, and he threw him to the ground.
Yo.
And so, because he was calling him names, and so that's when, and then there was a case, I had to come, my son is violent and so on, but he couldn't bear it. And I didn't know until it came to that crux, where it was just too much for him. And all this idea now, wanting to identify with black symbols, wanting to braid his hair, was for me an indication now that now this is happening. He's aware of his blackness, which is to say, he's aware of what it means to be black, and then he wants to identify with it, to give, to enhance, and to reclaim his identity. And I think these are also important issues for us to think about when we think, for example, of moments such as the Rose Must Fall, moments in South Africa, and that whole uprising, and how it was so much also about, it was about the statues, but it was also about identity.
Yes.
And so it's just such a critical turning point that we need to understand as well, in terms of this idea of an awareness of who you are in a world that is dominated by whiteness.
Yeah, let's explore more this whole issue of identity, right? Because I do understand that white people see their superiority as their identity. This is probably why you are really struggling to deal with this issue of racism. Because if you believe yourself to be superior, you need someone to be inferior. Otherwise, who are you superior to? Which is why, for instance, the examples that you are giving of these students who come into residences where they have to live with other black people, and then they realize, but I'm actually not superior, and there's a whole psychological
veil that
yes,
has covered their eyes for all these years.
Exactly. And how also black people have identified themselves with this blackness, which translates into inferiority, right? I remember I saw this video that was doing its rounds of a white mother, and I think two of her daughters. They were beating this young black girl. She was on the ground. She was fighting. And there were white men who were passing by as if nothing is happening. But I was looking at this little girl, white girl, who wanted this girl to be down. You must be down. It's like, stay in your lane, crush her, stay in your lane. You are inferior, you are black, you belong down there. The expression in this little girl's face, I thought, okay, this young lady who's on the ground obviously is confident. And now it is her undoing, this little white girl. So we must put you in your place, remain inferior, so that my identity of superiority is safe.
There's a story. We did some research with colleagues. It was led by colleagues at the time at Pretoria University. Norman Duncan was leading the project on, it was called the Apartheid Archive. And basically asked people to write a narrative on their first encounter with apartheid, first experience of what apartheid is, their experience of apartheid and racism. And one of the stories that is very, illustrative of the kinds of things that you are talking about is a woman who is now, she describes herself as she's now a professor, she's an adult, and she's now engaged actually in more liberal politics. But she tells a story of what happened when she was 8 years old in East London. She's in East London with her mother. They're walking in the main streets on Oxford Street in East London. And as they're walking with their mother, they see a black woman window shopping, stopping at a window shop, at one of the shops, big shops, looking at just clothes. And she just captures the sight of this woman's shoes. And she looks at this woman's shoes. She says, and she writes, she says, I remember looking at this woman, we're just passing by. And for a moment, my eyes caught, her shoe, the shoes she was wearing. And I saw they're really beautiful shoes. And I thought to myself, a black woman should not wear such shoes.
Wow.
So, that to me becomes almost like a metaphor for how white people see black people. A black woman should not be wearing such nice shoes. So in all our encounters, whether it is in the corridors of power, of the corporate sector, you're not supposed to be wearing those shoes as a black person. Now remember someone who is 8 years old, thinking that already. And such a simple, banal moment of what someone is dressed like. A black woman is not supposed to wear those shoes,
Sure.
and it's an issue enough for her
To notice it.
Exactly. And to
Sure.
reflect on it and to think along racial lines. So that is the internalization issue of superiority, white people having internalized their sense of being. And you're right. In order to be that, it requires that woman not to be wearing those kinds of shoes.
Yes.
And so if you start acting all confident, you find sometimes there are just indescribable tensions that sometimes in the corporate world or in the academic world, tensions that somehow you can't put your finger on it. What's going on here? What is this tension about? And it's all about how the person who perceives themselves as being superior is so stuck with that in a way that they're not even aware of. There's a term now in psychology that's called unconscious bias. I'm not sure about that, about the usefulness of the term, broadly speaking. But it's true that there's something that exists at that level, at the deep kind of level, at the deeper internal level. Something does exist. But it does not only exist in the unconscious. I think that's where the mistake is, that it's not only unconscious. There's also, an operational level of this unconscious bias in terms of the behavior, the actual behavior. But that also is there. So you find, for example, people with good intentions, aiming to engage. Sometimes people we work with in this field of trying to transform and change, sometimes something slips in and you see, there is that history emerging. And so it's really, to what extent is the person open to recognizing those moments that show up, that show them up,
Yeah.
so that they can then, in a more open way, address the emergence of that confirmation of the existence of those racial biases that are deeply ingrained in order to deal with them. Unfortunately, in our society, there is so much denial. Racism or the label of racism, of being racist, is an insult, is a shaming insult that is so often denied. And it so often silences dialogue rather than opening it up. And so in the end, it's not dealt with. People are afraid, they're ashamed, they feel that they're being judged. As a result, they deny it. And yet, the more open people are, the better we are able to deal with it.
Yeah. At the race dialogue that we had late last year as Awakened, there was this young man who really shared a moving story of how he has started in this job. And he has always seen himself to be, confident, smart, and hardworking. And his boss keeps saying to him, you are arrogant and egoistic. So he's trying to make sense of this whole thing, because, this white boss is reacting to a confident black person. And as far as he's concerned, we're not supposed to be confident.
Exactly.
So he's intimidated by this confidence. And what broke my heart was how this young man was saying, now I'm thinking about how can I tone down,
oh my God,
so that my relationship with my boss is okay. So I find that in these corporate spaces, black people opt for self-abandonment so that they can fit in, so that they can be accepted. And I always wonder, if we're going to tone down, how are we ever going to reach our full potential in these spaces? Because then we sort of continue this narrative of inferiority, and because white people insist that you must stay inferior and all of that. Just talk to us about this whole issue of white fragility and black fragility as we respond to racism, especially at schools and these workspaces, because as you are saying, we can't even talk about race, because we're ashamed when we talk about race. And white people behave as if they are now victims. They are the real victims of apartheid. So we must just forget about the past. We can't even talk about racism, which is rife everywhere we go, even today.
In our research, we did research both at Free State University, where I was before Stellenbosch, and in general conversations at Stellenbosch University. We have not formalized our research yet at Stellenbosch University. But the word that keeps on coming up is assimilation. Students of color speaking about how they feel they have to assimilate. And that is a place where they find themselves, because they cannot be who they are. They find that they've got to accommodate, for whether one of our students actually did research in the sports area in high schools. He conducted research in these big sports, rugby, cricket. It was a master's research. And it was the same thing where young black kids who wanted to join these big teams would find ways of assimilating, in order to be acceptable. It's this idea of, being in kind of holding the space, holding a kind of an identity that is two-faced. One is the one who you are with your family and other people you are close to, and the other identity being the one you carry when you are in white spaces, because you kind of know what is required to be acceptable in those spaces. Now the question is, how do we regard this kind of response? So on the one hand, it is a survival technique. It is a survival tactic that, in a way, gives you a sense of wisdom over the other. It empowers you to be wise, to know how to negotiate yourself. So on the one hand, it is a survival, and it is a strength in that sense, that you are wiser, you know how to behave. So that's one level. On the other hand, however, the tragedy is that you become who you are not. You become who the other says
you are.
You take on the identity of the other. Now, the problem with that is that othering, that gaze of the other, that puts you in your place. If in the course of building the survival outlook, you then reduce your sense of who you are and confirm the gaze of the other as that one that is inferior, that you are perverting your own sense of identity. You are, in other words, you are complicit. Now, this is a difficult thing to say, because to say that you are complicit in your own inferioritization ignores the fact that these relationships are relationships of power.
Yes.
So a black person who doesn't have that kind of